It's that time. Your fix is here. College football is a year-round discussion with these two. Here's JC and Morgan. Mike Morgan of ESPN and JC Sherbert of 24/7 Sports have you covered. Beginning right now.
It is another installment of JC and Morgan. He is JC Sherbert of 24/7 Sports. I'm Mike Morgan of ESPN and the SEC Network. We continue a really great list of guests this time of year. That's why this time of year, actually, from my podcast standpoint of view, has become one of my favorites. We know what we're going to do in the fall. That's kind of on autopilot. We react to the games. We preview games. We talk about the top stories. The off season, since we started having these guests, you folks out there have loved it and have told us that, and we just keep it going with people that we really think are just interesting to talk to from the vantage point of, yes, in the media, and very often former players, in this case, both. In the case of a guy who won a national title, did all kinds of things, both in high school and at Alabama, now has his own talk show with Cole Kublik, who we've had on this podcast before, as well as, you know him, of course, from ESPN as one of the top analysts on college football. He is Greg McElroy, and he joins us now. Greg, how are you, sir?
Good, guys. Thank y'all for having me. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you coming on. It just kind of worked out this way where we've had this string of quarterbacks, and it's funny, like, you're on TV so much now. Like, pretty soon there's going to be a generation of people that are like, I didn't know Greg McElroy played quarterback. Like they're going to know you as the guy who is they see pop up on their high def. And of course, if you're listening to one of the better college football radio shows in the country, for my money, then they know you from that with the work you do with Cole. So it's got to be a little bit interesting from that aspect. You've really kind of hit the ground running in this broadcasting world that you're now in.
Well, it's been strange to kind of transition. I retired from the NFL 10 years ago, or just about 10 years ago. I retired in March of 2014 after I had kind of agreed with SEC Network to latch on and be a part of the launch. About 6 months later than that, I was still under contract with the Bengals, was planning on going back to camp. And it's like, you blink a couple times, and next thing you know, it's been a decade. It's right. Like, it's wild. And it's look, I always thought that this would be kind of a part-time job. I don't know how you approached it, Mike. I mean, I don't know if you approached it this way, JC, but like, college football was kind of a hobby. That's kind of how I viewed it. Right. And then when I got into it, I kind of became captivated by this world and realized that if you want to cover it appropriately, it's not like I'll just go 9 to 5 and then in the afternoons I'll look at some college football stuff. Like, it doesn't work that way. So you have to live it year round, especially in the portal era. And, I, like y'all, am extremely lucky to do what I love every day, and that's cover the sport that I care most about.
No doubt about it. And we've had here's where all three of our worlds meet. We'll get to JC's brush with McElroy in a moment. You probably don't know this, but in 2014, the year you referenced, I get a phone call from a guy who was our boss, Steve Ackles, kind of in a roundabout way, might still be, who knows? That's a whole other story. But he says, hey, and back then I was not full-time quite yet with ESPN. I was still doing games for another network. And he asked if I could do a college football game at Texas A&M. And he said, you'd be working with Greg McElroy, which I believe would have been your first game, would it not? Texas A&M Lamar, I think.
Lamar, that's exactly who it was. It was week 2, right after Kenny Hill went out and lit up South Carolina. And
that's right.
The following week. Yep.
So the hardest thing for me to do, I so wanted to do that, and the excitement level of getting a chance to work with you. I work with a lot of first-time analysts, including one of your former teammates, Barrett Jones. And I always enjoy that. And I just, for some reason, just remembering you as a quarterback, knew that you were going to take this like a duck to water. So I was like, this would be just a natural transition for him, be a lot of fun. So anyway, long story short, I had said no. And since then we've never actually worked together, sadly.
Dave Baker slid in.
That's right.
One of the 3 days.
The bus, yes, Dave Bus Baker.
And we had, I'll never forget. You never forget your first truck. So we had, it was on all hands on deck. I've since worked with the director a couple times on spring games, random one-offs.
Right.
But Bob Goodrich was
Okay.
the producer, and
Mhm.
Bob Goodrich. This is real inside baseball for anyone that's watching that hasn't been in a booth before, which I'm sure is a significant majority of your audience.
Right.
Bob Goodrich is like a Hall of Famer, but
Mhm.
he's cut from the old school cloth. Like, he's hardcore. And like, if you hear a 4-letter word in your earpiece, like, you just go with it. Like,
Right.
so
Just don't repeat it.
it felt very comfortable for me coming from the football world. So I'm disappointed that you weren't in the booth alongside, but
Yes.
I was drinking through a fire hose that night with 2 tempo teams, and I didn't know what the heck was going on. They kind of just throw you out there and see how you do.
That's what people don't realize. They'll take an analyst and just throw him to the wolves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You figure it out. It's honestly, it's survival mode.
Right.
I mean, yeah, you call the game, but we all practice calling the game. Like, why did that stupid announcer say that?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I say that about myself when I'm watching things back. Like, why did I say that there?
Right.
But at the same time, it's like, man, you're just trying to get to the next play. It's like...
Well, but I think what people appreciate about you, and this came from an early spot, and you're right, 10 years has snuck up on all of us, is that it's opinions, but it's educated opinions. It's thought out opinions in a universe of hot takes. That's never been your bag, whether it's on radio or whether it's calling a game. It just seems like a well thought out analysis of whatever the thing is, whether it's a play you just saw or whether it's a storyline, what have you. And I mean, you do a lot of hits on various shows on the ESPN networks, and I just my opinion. I'm not just saying this because you're on. When I see Greg McElroy about to give his take, I know it's a thought out. Not the temptation to just, I got to be far one way or another, right? Like, I just got to be a super strong opinion on this. It's just well thought out and intellectually sound, I guess, is what I'm looking for. And I've always appreciated about that. That goes above and beyond what you do calling a game, which obviously that is something you've adjusted to very well, but that's just always been my scouting report on Greg McElroy, the analyst. And I appreciate guys that do that actually think before they just blurt something out.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I try to be thoughtful, probably to a fault at times in my life and in my playing career, probably a little over analytical, probably overthink things a little too much. I see the gray area. Mm-hmm. Probably a little too much, especially in a world in college football and decision making. It's black and white. It's not like, well, why'd you go there? Well, you could have gone there. It's like you either went to the right receiver or you didn't. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's not like, well, you could have tried that. Well, you could. I mean, sure, there is. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, there is a gray area. But what I've always tried to do is I always try to see the person underneath the helmet. I try to see the person on the sideline underneath the hat. People see dollar signs aligned with these coaches, and it's easy to be critical. Mm-hmm. But there is a family behind that coach. There is a fan base behind that coach. There's a mom and a dad behind that coach. I was talking to an athletic director yesterday on the phone. Then he said, I just want you to know, like I appreciate your stance on fill in the blank subject, and we won't go down the rabbit hole. He goes, I just appreciate your stance on that. Like, you could have very easily been really, really critical, and you weren't. You tried to find the silver lining, and you tried to understand why we did what we did collectively and the decision that we ultimately decided to make. It was in regards to the college football playoff and the 12-team playoff model and the format. I don't feel like I'm going to be giving up my source or my relationship by telling you what the source was calling about. It was about the 12-team playoff. I said, hey, man, look, there are some flaws. There are some things we'd like to get figured out, but we appreciate you not going scorched earth. I said, because you guys are doing the best you can. Mm-hmm. Like, there are pre-existing contracts in place. There are challenges that we have to overcome as a sport when it comes to the NFL scheduling model. And we don't want to go head to head, and weekday games aren't ideal for fans, and multiple neutral site games aren't ideal for fans. But currently, with the current structure that we have, it's the best we can do. Right. And I think it's real easy to be super critical. I think it's real easy to say, well, that coach doesn't know what the heck he's doing. They stink. He's making $10 million a year. He better figure it out. It'd be easy to say that, but that coach might have 2 daughters at school that are taking a lot of heat at school as they, go to high school, middle school, elementary school, in the community in which he coaches. and they're hearing what we say. So I try to see the person behind, and I try to understand the why. And I've always tried to understand the why. There's a reason why people do things, whether that's in the heat of battle during a game, or whether it's a decision on a recruit, or a decision on whether or not you need to clear out the entire roster and refill it with a bunch of portal guys, like with what's going on with Deion Sanders at Colorado. I mean, there's a why, and I try to understand why. And I think as a result, I've developed some good relationships with coaches. Not that I'm going to propagandize by any stretch, but if I come with the criticism, it's because I genuinely believe that's the correct decision. And I'm not always right. There have been a million examples of which I've been wrong, but at least I can look myself in the mirror at the end of the day knowing that I gave my opinion, and I didn't do it in an effort to go viral. I did it because I'm really trying to educate every time we go on the camera.
It's genuine. Yeah. That was the other word I was looking for. Go ahead, JC.
Yeah, I think it's about fairness. I mean, that's one of the things during and I'm kind of retired from journalism. I don't claim that title anymore. I'm much more of a personality or
journalism's a hot word right now. That's a tricky word. You going down the rabbit hole there.
I'm not claiming it anymore, but I did my first job in journalism. I was a high school sports reporter in Gainesville, Georgia, before Deshaun Watson and all those guys came out of Gainesville. But I had an editor. He was a Vietnam vet named Mickey, and he loved Marshall. And he used to talk like this. He'd put a JC, go Herd. But he would always be like, you need to be, I don't care what you write. You just need to be fair. Be fair. He said it over and over again like that.
Right.
God bless you, Mickey, if you're still hanging in there out there. He kind of was like a pack-a-day smoker and some stuff back in the early 2000s. But anyway, that's always stuck with me. And I've always just tried to be fair. And you mentioned that this really is good because you mentioned understand the why. Understand the why. And I've been critical before. There's things I have very strong opinions about things. Of course. But I can always kind of get where people are coming from. And then the human element, I think fans in general these days, because we're in the era where you can say anything you want and not get punched in the face because it's on the internet, right? You're behind a screen. I think fans in general have totally lost track, and maybe they never were this way, of the human side of it, be it coaches, recruits, whatever. This is not Xbox. These are not robots. They're not out there, if they make a bad play, it's not the guy with the controller may have hit the right buttons, right? It's just that they're humans, right? And so I appreciate that. I think that's probably why people really listen and respect what you say on a daily basis about the sport, is because you could sense that that's not something you could fake.
Well, I also think too, it comes from in a perfect world, and I'm sure JC and Mike, you guys, I mean, you've covered teams long enough, you've been around the sport long enough, you find that while I will always be proud of my allegiances to Alabama, always, that's my alma mater, it's my sister's alma mater, I have multiple degrees from there, I live in Birmingham, Alabama, I am a Bama guy through and through, but at the same time, you kind of fall in love with the storylines of people. So people are like, well, why do you why are you a guy that would ever be so complimentary of a Tennessee or of an Auburn? Why people have a hard time understanding that because they think, if you're a Bama guy, you're through and through Bama, you hate Auburn, you hate Tennessee, and you hate Georgia. That's just the way it is. And I don't see it that way because there are several people, the team I hated more than anyone in school was Florida. I hated Florida. Loathed the Florida Gators, hated Urban Meyer, hated Tim Tebow, hated them more than anything in the entire world. And I mean, Tim knows this. It's not like it's not a secret. They were the alpha dogs in college football and we wanted to beat them. But then as I got to know Tim, it's like, man, I can't believe I really disliked this guy in college. You know what I mean? And then Jim McElwain ends up as the Florida Gator head coach. And it's like, man, I really want Florida to do well. And then Billy Napier ultimately gets it. And Dan Mullen, several of which have been my friends. I've known Dan for years, dating back to his time as the OC at Florida. And, it's like, how could I found that you start rooting more for people than you do for places. And that's been a bit of a kind of a change for me. And I think it's a little different for the fan because they view it through the lens of I'm this team. So therefore, because of the way I've been raised, I am raised to dislike and or loathe this team. For instance, as a guy that lives in Birmingham, if Alabama and Auburn are undefeated at 11-0 in the Iron Bowl every year, that is the greatest thing for the state of Alabama you could possibly imagine. Now, it's going to make for some interesting Thanksgiving dinners, but it would be phenomenal for the state. And it's something, and it's an outcome that I root for every year. And it's just the way it is. So I think part of it, yes, understand the why, understand the human element, but also at the same time, man, I swear on my life, I just want college football to be healthy. I want college football and the positivity around college football to exist. We live in a negative world where everyone, and I've heard this for years now, well, college football is not the same as it once was. I don't love it as much as I used to. The NIL has turned me off. I don't like the portal. I don't like kids sitting out of bowl games. I don't like all these, like all I hear are negatives, like negative. It's like, it's so easy to be critical, but at the same time, there are also, along with the negative, I'd be lying if I told you that all the aspects of college football make me happy. They don't. There's things about it I would change. There's things about it I dislike. But while acknowledging that those things exist, I think it's also important to tell the positive stories and the first-time college graduates, first-time college attendees, the guys that are receiving degrees, the guys that opportunity to play for their hometown school, the guys that, ultimately go on and the lucky ones, the 1% that get an opportunity to go earn 6-7 figures in the NFL, 8 figures in some cases. It's just those are the stories that I think are kind of lost in the weeds in the hyper focused, I guess, approach of everyone in an effort to win. So I just think we don't cover the sport as positively as we should. So I've definitely tried to do that as well, because it's easy to find the negative, and you got to look a little bit harder to find the positive from time to time.
And I think that to your point, the negative's always been there. It's just reported on more. There's the social media and more sports talk radio than ever, 24/7 sports networks, some covering one specific conference, like all the things that you could think of that are so-called negatives that fans are upset about now. I realize NIL and the portal are different, but look, everything else was going on, whether we wanted to acknowledge it or not. Like, kids were getting paid in many cases long before we had NIL. Players,
but it's also the round-the-clock coverage too. I think
that's it.
Hey, we always have to be churning out content.
That's it,
that's okay too. But like when toe meets leather, college football used to exist in a microcosm. We played games on Saturdays. You got to watch 6 or 7 games. Those are the only ones available to you. So you got to watch 6 or 7 games, and it was very celebratory. So people look back at that time where it was so nostalgic. Whereas we voted, for crying out loud, on a national champion back then. How does that make sense? Like you're an AP writer that is determining who's the best team in college football. Like how messed up that is?
It's laughable.
It's ridiculous.
It's the only sport that's ever done it. That's why I always say I made a pledge when they went to 4 teams, and I never thought 4 was going to be enough. Just one man's opinion. I thought my ideal number was always 8. But I made a pact that if we ever got rid of the BCS after 20 long, anguishing years, and after 100 years of, as you pointed out, just voting on champions and split champions and everything else, I would not complain about anything, because I'd just be so happy that we'd have some semblance of a playoff.
Right.
And so we did. We got 4. Perfect? No, but it served its purpose, and it sure as heck was better than what we had. Now it's going to 12, and it took me a while to kind of wrap my arms around 12. Is that going to affect the importance of some of the regular season games? But then I see like all the positives that come with 12. So like I'm all in. There's so many things you could complain about. I'm not going to complain about that.
Yeah. And I'm with you. I mean, there are aspects of the 12-team playoff that I'd really like to see changed. For instance, I'll give you an example. I hate that the second round games are going to be played at neutral site.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I personally think that if you win your conference championship, you should be awarded with a home playoff game. That's just my own personal thought. Now, but given the fact that there are already multiple, 6 to be exact, bowl relationships with the CFP, like that ain't changing. It just has to be what it is right now. So yes, I'd like to see tweaks, and we get 2-year sample size. We get a 2-year focus group to see, hey, does this work? Are there things that we can do better before we wipe the slate clean in 2026? But it's imperfect, but I'll tell you this, man, when toe meets leather, it's pretty dang good.
No.
And I think if we just focus on the pageantry of the game, the experience that you get when you step on campus, the energy you feel when you step on campus, the youthful exuberance you feel even as an adult that's in your 70s, how you feel when you walk through the tunnel and walk up the grandstands to your seat that you've been sitting in for 50 years. I mean, there's just something really special about that. And the fact that it's I think, I used to think baseball was the great, generational connector. Like, I learned baseball from my dad. My dad learned baseball from his dad. He learned baseball from his. That was the thing. And I think baseball, because of its pace of play, and we can talk about the rule changes and all the things that have happened, how much better it is this year. Yeah, it's great. But I don't think baseball is that anymore. I think it's actually college football. I think college football is passed down from generation to generation. And it's I think, really special. And it's one that I've tried to keep alive, even though I'm on the road every single week going to games all over the country. We have season tickets, and my two sons and my wife, they go to the game. And that's something that obviously I'm not there, but it's being passed down, and hopefully someday they'll pass it on to their kids and so on and so forth. So I do think that there's something really special about college football and the game day experience. And as long as we continue to focus on that, we'll continue to have so many positive things to be excited about.
Yeah, for years I've said it's the Teflon sport. No matter how hard some people try to screw it up over many, many decades, college football it's impervious to anything you do to try to destroy it. The passion that fans have for it, it's not going anywhere. It's only expanding. Other sports have to battle the ebbs and flows. College football really hasn't had to do that. Greg, usually when we have guests on, we it's a little bit of this is your life. So I mentioned JC, and you have crossed paths before, going back to his national recruiting days. So, JC, break it down.
Yeah.
First of all, how many stars do we have Greg McElroy at? A future national championship quarterback, NFL quarterback. How many stars was he looking at?
He was a Texas kid, and so Texas was like, I covered the SEC, but Texas was not an SEC state at the time. I think he ended up at 4.
I was at 3, JC. Don't try to round up now. All right.
Man, all right.
But it's understandable. Like, back then, if you actually look at the amount of guys that received 4 stars, there were a lot fewer that received 4 stars back then. No, that's not. Look, maybe players are just more ready to jump. I don't know how y'all's grading works. I think 247 is an amazing job. I mean, I use it as a resource all the time. I can't watch all the tape of high school kids, so I rely on what you guys do, and I'm very, very grateful and appreciative to the amount of time and resources that you guys put into it. But I was a 3-star, but that year it was very unique. Matthew Stafford, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area alone, Matthew Stafford, he won the 4A title. I won the 5A title. I was a 3-star at Southlake. Christian Ponder was in our division. Christian Ponder ultimately ended up at Florida State. Andy Dalton was a 3-star, ended up at TCU. He was actually out of Houston. We played him in the state championship game. But Texas, during that time period, and it's still good. It's still really, really good. But the amount of quarterbacks that came out of Texas in like a 3 or 4 year period was insane. Nick Foles, the 4 that I already mentioned, guys that are all playing on Sundays. Ryan Mallett was another guy. Colt McCoy, of course, was a year or 2 older than I was. I mean, there were so many good ones that had come out during that time frame. So for me to be a 3-star, it was actually probably the best thing for me. I went into it with a bit of a chip on my shoulder, and I was always kind of grateful to be under recruited. I thought that kind of provided me the extra boost and the extra motivation to prove people wrong. And it suited me well. Whereas if I was over recruited, that would have been, I think, harder to kind of fill those expectations. And you go in with nothing to lose. It allows you to kind of blossom and take your own path and be patient as the opportunities present themselves.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
You were actually committed to Texas Tech, right? For a while.
I was, yeah.
Coach Leach, and RIP to him, by the way, one of my favorite people in the sport. But and then Alabama came in late, and you mentioned Tebow earlier. Alabama, I believe, in that class, if I'm not mistaken, in 07, that was Tim's class. Shula sort of went the distance with him. And even though it was probably always Florida, and then they kind of circled back on you. So that was kind of an interesting recruitment as well. A lot of people, you're synonymous with the Saban era, but a lot of people make it lost on them that Mike Shula is actually the one that spotted you and signed you at Alabama.
He was, and it was an interesting. So Tim and Mike Shula, and I always appreciated this about Mike, is he was very transparent throughout the entire process. He said, we are offering one guy. We don't have to have a quarterback. We have 4 on scholarship right now, but we're going to offer one guy, and that guy's going to be Tim Tebow. And if he decides to come here, then our, obviously no quarterbacks will be taken beyond that. But if he decides to go elsewhere, we're going to reevaluate things. At that point, I was committed to Texas Tech early in the process, probably week 3 of my senior season. Only started 1 year in high school, backed up Chase Daniel, who went on to finish, runner-up or third in the Heisman at Missouri, and is still in the NFL, amazingly enough. So backed him up. So I didn't really get to play a lot until my senior year. Before I started my senior year, though, before I ever started a game, and this was a weird time because it didn't happen like this, I still had 10 scholarship offers because Chase would go play baseball and I would get a lion's share of the reps in the spring. And they're like, who's this number 17? He's pretty good. So I ended up getting offers from a lot of smaller schools, the Rices of the world, SMU, Baylor. Baylor at the time was not good. They were probably, of the teams that offered me, they were probably the worst team, which is crazy what they inevitably became. But that was the Guy Morris era, and they were like 1-11 in a good year. But Phil Bennett was at SMU. He offered me. TCU offered me early. Coach, I still have so much appreciation for Coach Patterson and taking a chance on me early on. BYU offered. Kansas offered. So it was a bunch of kind of smaller schools. But ultimately, I'd always said, I'm going to make a decision because I don't want to be thinking about the recruiting process. I'm going to make one early. Texas Tech at the time was the best available. I committed to Texas Tech over North Carolina there in my 3rd week of my senior year. And then at the end of the year, after we won the state championship, I kind of reassessed everything, took my visits, and ultimately decided that the best place for me was Alabama. It just aligned with what I wanted from a college experience. Now, at that point, did I think a national championship was within reach? I think I would have told you as an 18-year-old, yes. But if I were to say, your life depends on winning a national championship, I would have said, all right, that's probably pretty unlikely. But I knew we had a good class. Of the guys we signed in that class, I think we signed like 22 or 23 guys. Like 10 or 12 had won state championships in high school. And to me, I wanted to be aligned with winners. And I resonated with that class probably as much as anywhere else I took a visit. Took a visit to Colorado. At that point, they were pretty dang good. And Dan Hawkins was coming down from Boise. I had known Dan for a long time. Took a visit to Ole Miss. Ed Ogeron was the head coach there at that time. I took a visit to North Carolina. Honestly, North Carolina was right there in the mix, and then had taken a couple other unofficials to kind of evaluate the whole process. Tennessee. Was
it Butch at Carolina at that time?
He didn't get there at that time. It was right before Butch. Bunting.
Bunting. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was weird, though, to me because they got shelled. The game that I took my visit to go see them, they got shelled, and all the guys were like, all right, we're still going to go out. Y'all want to go out? I'm like, y'all just got beat. I'd be crying into my pillow. Like, this doesn't align with me. Like, I want to win. Right. Like, if we lose, like, I'm going and I'm like thinking about, don't jump off the cliff. Like, that's just how I approached it. In high school, we went 63-1. So, Bama was the best place for me. And ultimately, when Saban got there, it was warp speed all the way to the top of college football. And it was just really fun to see things change the way it did.
Do you follow Tyler Watts, or am I missing a bridge guy?
So Tyler Watts, Brody Croyle,
Brody,
and then John Parker Wilson, and then me.
Oh, I missed 2 bridge guy. I forgot about John Parker Wilson.
Yeah, John Parker was Saban's first year, and then
that's right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, so John Parker was the starting quarterback in 6, 7, 8. I was the starting quarterback in 9 and 10.
Yeah,
okay.
So John Parker was there for Saban's first 2 years.
Okay, and so but you were the first one to win the national championship. That's right. I think those years kind of blend together, and of course that 07 or 08 class that Bama signed was, I thought that kind of put them over the top. Just so many great players. It was such a great in-state group that year. Julio Jones, all those guys, even guys like Marcel Darius. You talk about rankings. Marcel Darius is like a high 3-star out of Birmingham. You know, and they got Auburn had kind of tilted the scales in state a little bit before Saban got there. And then all of a sudden, Bama just gets everybody. And then,
at that point, Auburn had won like 5 or 6 Iron Bowls in a row. Mm-hmm. So I remember Tommy Tupperville, who's become a real good friend. He was the fear of the thumb, and I loathed Tommy Tupperville in college. Goodness gracious. Like, he just poked at us and poked at us and poked at us. And finally we got over the hump in 08. But you look at that 08 class, it was really a massive class. I mean, it was a great, and I remember walking through the door our first summer workouts when that 08 class arrived. And this was before the era where everybody graduated early and came in January. Probably had 3 or 4 guys in January, but most of the guys arrived in June. And I remember having freshmen walk in. Michael Williams was the one that stood out the most. And Julio, like, everyone knew Julio was going to be a freak. Like, that was, we knew he was going to be different. 18-year-olds just don't look that physically mature. But Michael Williams was the guy that probably stood out the most. It's like, who the heck is this guy? He's like some random guy from Eufaula or wherever it was. And he's like 6'8". He's like 6'8", 270, and he's like I'm like, who is this guy?
My goodness, yeah.
So it was just one of those things. But you look at the 09 group, yes, we were certainly boosted with a lot of good young quality pieces from that 08 class, but really the nucleus of that 09 team and the glue that kind of held it all together. And I think what made us real special is that we had a lot of self-made guys on that roster. Mm-hmm. Left tackle was a first-round pick. The left guard, Mike Johnson, was a third-round pick. Great player. Center, undrafted, never played in the NFL, William Vallejos. Right guard was Barrett Jones. At that point, he was a redshirt freshman. Really good player, really more smart than he was talented at that phase of his career. Right tackle was Drew Davis, a guy, little 2-star prospect from Evergreen, Alabama, was just as tough as nails and was kind of a tone setter for us. Our tight end was Preston Dial. Never played in the NFL, but was 6'2", 250 and would rip your face off. Looks like you look at him, what are those Rock'em Sock'em Robots?
Robots, yeah.
His head was like that. I mean, he just had a battering ram head and was our H-back, and still one of my best friends, my roommate in college, that never played in the NFL, but was just a grinder in that 06 class. 08, our other tight end was Colin Peake, never played in the NFL, transferred over from Georgia Tech when they went to the triple option, but not really like a future NFL guy by any stretch. Our slot receiver was Darius Hanks, was an under-recruited 3-star guy who was awesome, great route runner, never had the volume that he probably would have liked, and we were run first team. Julio, of course, at X was unbelievable. And then we have Marquise Mays, who still to this day is one of my favorite teammates of all time, never played in the NFL, but was 5'8" and played like he was 6'4". So the offense, I mean, that's the starting offense. And Trent and Mark, obviously, at running back, were as good as it gets. But it's not like it was an all-star team by any stretch of the imagination. It was a bunch of guys that just worked really hard and were tough as nails and weren't going to be beat up. We were going to beat you up, and that's why we were as good as we were. So defensively, you can go to the other side. I mean, Eric Anders, great MMA fighter, never an NFL player. Corey Reamer, those are our 2 bookend stand-up outside linebackers, 2 really good players, but never played in the NFL. On the interior, yes, Darius was amazing, but Lorenzo Washington played a little bit in the NFL, and Brandon Dedrick played a little bit in the NFL, but neither had a super long career. Rolando was incredible, obviously at middle linebacker. He could have played as long as he wanted to play. Kareem Jackson, who's still in the league at corner. Marquise Johnson and Javier Arenas were the other 2 corners. Javi had a really nice career, but that was more as a punt return guy. Marquise never really had a chance to play. Mark Barron, who, of course, was a first-round pick, great player in the NFL, and then Justin Woodall, who never played in the NFL. So it's not like it was an all-star team at that point either. It was really a lot of guys that kind of bought in and that were a part of the ascent and ultimately turned themselves into really good players. But a lot of the guys were really self-made. They didn't start on third base by any stretch. They had to earn it, and they had to earn the staff's trust, because several of which were inherited by Saban and their staff. So it was a cool mix of people, and we're still, I think, really, really close as a result of the experiences we went through.
It's pretty amazing recall on your part, by the way. This is the benefit of not playing in the NFL for like 12 years. You don't take as many shots, and you're able to just recite that like it happened 24 hours ago.
If you were to ask me who wore what number all the way from 1 through 99, I could probably tell you every single guy, and that's including walk-ons, just because it was just a special group and we were really close. And
yeah,
no one expected us to win it. We were kind of hiding in the weeds all year long, and then sure enough, get our shot at Florida in the SEC championship and smoke them.
See that game
a couple weeks
I've
later, beat Texas.
Greg, I think that 09 game, look, I've been a college fan my whole life. I've covered the SEC, half of it. I would make an argument that's one of the most important games in the history of the sport, not just the SEC, because and you referenced the Urban Meyer run and the Tebow run and the titles in 06 and 08. And I don't remember what the point spread was in 09, but I know you guys were an underdog. Most people thought Florida was going to do what Florida was doing at that time, was just beating people up and winning the SEC and then playing for national championships. That changed the complete impetus of two programs for a long, long time. I mean, you could make the argument Florida really hasn't recovered. Urban Meyer was gone not too much longer after that, and they haven't had great success since. And it was clearly the beginning of a dynasty, the likes of which I'm not sure we'll ever see again in our lifetime. So take us back. Let's all absorb it. I know a lot of Alabama fans already know this story, but for the other college football fans listening to us nationwide, what kind of vibe did you have going into that game, first off, when everybody's saying, oh, Florida's going to win it again, Florida's going to win it again? And then when did you feel like, oh, no, we got a chance to do this?
Well, I think the first play really stands out to me. We took the ball. We didn't take the ball very often. More often than not, we deferred to the second half, but we wanted to be aggressive. So we took the ball and we went back in the first play of the game. We came out in a formation that they hadn't seen before. We put Julio in the slot in a 3-by-1, and Julio runs a little crossing route, and the protection held up for quite a while. The route took a little while to develop, and I hit him on an over route, and it was like a gain of 15, 16 yards. And from then on out, I was like, we got him, because we knew they were going to play man, and that was Charlie Strong's bread and butter. He was going to run man coverage. We knew that they were going to run man coverage. We knew that Brandon Spikes was going to play man and blitz, and they're going to try to overload the back and all this other stuff. So like we knew exactly what we were going to get. And sure enough, first snap of the game, that's what we got. And we're like, all right, let's go. We go right down the field, kick a field goal on the opening drive. We stop them. We get the ball back. We go right down the field again. Just ding, 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 do, just lighten them up. And we had not really at that point of the season, we hadn't really thrown the ball a lot. Throwing the ball had been kind of a secondary resource for us. So we knew in that game, they were really stout against the run. Their front seven was really, really good, and running the ball was going to be very difficult. So we knew that we had to be aggressive through the air, and we were able to do that with some new formations that we hadn't used all year long. And it was, we knew going into the game, we weren't sure if we could run with them. That was a big question, because they could run. They could fly, which probably shouldn't surprise that many people. You look at the roster, it was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous across the charts. Corners were amazing. We felt good about our wide receiver matchups. We knew Jones could win, but Jones had 2 catches for 28 yards in that game, including that the first play of the game. So he was not a huge factor in the game whatsoever. We thought that we were going to have to win against Janoris Jenkins, and that was with Marquise Mays, who ended up having a really nice game. And we knew our tight ends were going to have to be really big for us as well. Colin Peake had a couple big catches, one in particular in the back of the end zone on a little throwback that we had worked, but they had covered that throwback actually perfectly. So when I was able to somehow fit it in when they ran the perfect coverage for it, and we were still able to score, and we knew that their perfect coverage wasn't going to beat our perfect execution, it's like, this is going to get sideways. And it did. And we knew if we had a lead in the fourth quarter, it was over, because there was nobody that was touching us in the fourth quarter. From our conditioning standpoint, from our toughness standpoint, no one could play with us there. We felt very, very good about that. Our whole offseason is fourth quarter. I mean, Scott Cochran, the whole group, that's all it was about. So we felt really, really confident with our plan. We felt really confident knowing that we had absolutely nothing to lose. All the pressure was on them, and we were able to go out and play really freely. And all the guys responded well to the adversity that we faced there in the third quarter. By just as soon as it got close and they started to close the gap, boom, we answered. And it was it was all she wrote from that point. Every time they punched, we punched back harder. And it was a cool game to be a part of because it was an indicator of what was to come. And it was 4 years of grinding that was paying off over the course of a 3.5 hour period. And that, you know, don't know how many times those opportunities will present themselves. To know that we were able to seize it was pretty special. And it's one that we will obviously always remember and always celebrate.
It's the one that got it all rolling. I mean, pun intended. Like it without that, who knows how the trajectory of the SEC changes. But you get the feeling eventually Nick would have imposed his will. And that's the thing too about Saban, is that like I had an Alabama game this year, and you know, when you do a game on TV, you sit with the coaches, and of course for 30 minutes we didn't even have to ask a question. He went off on NIL and the portal and everything else. Nick is not shy about giving his opinions on that, but I made sure I soaked it all in because I don't know how much longer this guy's going to coach. And I think we just kind of now we've take for granted that Saban is here, and you know, whoop-de-doo, Alabama's going to win 11 games plus a year, but he could just hang it up next year, a year. You never know. And I guess of all the millions of Saban questions you get, you maybe get tired of answering all these. I'm trying to put my finger on, because I've been around him not nearly as much as you, obviously, or people that have covered him exclusively. He doesn't wow you with his words, right? Like when you're in a meeting room with him, you don't necessarily you're not like, wow, that was unbelievable. He just said the most brilliant thing I've ever heard. And yet, you know, there's something that's in there with him that most coaches will never know and never have. So when did you realize, like, no, this guy's just flat out different? Because you mentioned he was not necessarily the guy that recruited you. That goes back to Coach Shula, but there had to be something where you're like maybe you were telling your dad, like, no, Dad, I'm telling you, this guy is unbelievable.
Well, I think probably he's just relentless, man. I mean, I think that's part of it. And he holds himself to such a remarkably high standard. Look, he worked us so hard. I mean, like the intensity of our workouts, our fourth quarter program, we went our first year for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of fourth quarter. Now the guys might do 3. And we did 6 weeks where it was just relentless grind and weeding out guys that couldn't do it. And by the way, his first year, we lost our last 4 games of the regular season.
That's right.
Because I think guys were just flat out exhausted, man. We gave it all we had, but it was a great learning experience of what you can put your body through. Was it militaristic at the time? Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm not saying that we went through, Navy SEAL training by any stretch of the imagination, but the football equivalent of it, I suppose it was to test you both mentally and physically. That was just remarkable. I think the big thing with him though, and he's just such a creature of habit, and he's robotic, and he's such a tactician that nothing gets overlooked. There is not one detail that's overlooked, and every single day he's the same. It's not like one day he's happy, one day he's sad, one day he's angry, one day he's happy. Like it's like he's the same guy every day. So having known him now for going on 16, 17 years, I've never not seen him be the way he is. And he's structured, he's regimented, and the consistency that he has within his own life and the consistency with what he expects from the program is why the program never dips, and why the program is steady and consistent. And they might not win every game, but there's going to be predictable performance just about every game. You play to your standard. It doesn't matter what the other team does. It doesn't matter what the score is. That's the process. You play each and every play as if it has a life of its own. And if you compile the 60, 70, 80, 85, 90 plays within the game, if you give your max effort on every single one and you win the majority of those plays, you're ultimately going to find success at the end of the day when you look up on the scoreboard. So I think he is just such a creature of habit, such a detail-oriented person, and he just stresses the process, that it's just, and honestly, I approach it in my own life. Like I try to be the same way every day for my kids. Like I'm always going to try to be the same. Like there's might be some tough love from time to time, but there might be some time where you love them up, like whatever the circumstances are. I mean, I'm going to try to be the same guy every day. I'm going to have the same process every day. I'm going to work out at this time. I'm going to go to do radio at this time. I'm going to do my podcast at this time. I'm going to do TV at this time. I'm going to watch tape at this time. So when you can create that consistency in your life, then you can have consistent results. And if your results are based on whether or not you win or lose the game every week, then more often than not, you're going to be on the right side of it. So I think it's easier said than done. But he really does an amazing job of making sure that you feel that every day. And he never asks you to do anything that he wouldn't ask himself to do. And I think that's something that every player can kind of relate to. And obviously the process works. I mean, as you can see with the results.
Yeah, it's going pretty well. I wanted to go ahead, JC.
Oh, no, I was just going to bring up on the other side of that spectrum, during that time period with Steve Spurrier, and we have a lot of South Carolina fans in our audience, so I'd be remiss not to ask you about the 2010 game. And also during that time period, I remember A.J. McCarron had a quote a year later. Bama had beaten Ohio University or somebody, and he's like, yeah, you got to do this, because the next thing you know, you're playing South Carolina in the Georgia Dome. A comment like that coming from the Alabama quarterback sort of shocked the Gamecock fans because it hadn't been the best history. What was kind of the perception over there in Tuscaloosa about the Gamecocks during the Spurrier era? I know the prediction you made in 2014, and I'm not gonna bring that up, because obviously they fell on their face. But what was kind of the thought about the Gamecocks back then? Because I thought that quote always struck with me. I was like, usually it'd say Georgia or Florida or somebody like that. And then if you have any thoughts on Shane Beamer and the job he's done so far.
Yeah, I mean, we always had a ton of respect for South Carolina. The year before, in 2009, the national championship year, they gave us a lot of fits. They played at our place, and we didn't play great by any stretch. We ran the ball really well. We had a couple early turnovers and just never really got into much of a rhythm offensively. That was a really talented South Carolina team. I know you really think back to it, though. Alshon and obviously Stephon Gilmore, just Lattimore. I mean, just a really, really talented group of guys. So I always had a tremendous, and I love Coach Spurrier. I mean, I grew up, my mom went to Florida State. So I grew up, on the other side of that rivalry. My uncle, ironically enough, went to Florida. So grew up kind of not necessarily loathing, but also at the same time, like having an unbelievable amount of respect for what Spurrier had built in the 90s. So to see him back on the sideline, he was like one of those guys where it's like, man, that's super cool. I can't believe I get to play in front of Steve Spurrier today. I had that same feeling with only a few other guys where it's like, man, I just can't wait to see that face on the other side of the sideline. Spurrier was one, Bobby Bowden was one, Frank Beamer was one. Urban Meyer, in a slightly lesser extent was one, but he was kind of coming of age, like as I was coming up, and I already mentioned the animosity at that point. So it wasn't quite the same with him. Joe Paterno, we played them my senior year. At that time, Joe Paterno, I thought he was just a god amongst mortals with the type of program that he had built. Obviously that was before everything that went down after the fact, but there were always a few coaches that you always kind of went and looked at on the side, like, man, it's just so cool. Like, I grew up watching that guy. Like, that's so awesome. Needless to say, I got Saban on our sideline. It's like, I don't care about him. It's like,
yeah. Well, it takes a little pressure off. What about the coaches of today? What are the coaches, whether it's guys you cover in preparing for a game or just watching the games on TV or following the sport as a whole? Who are the coaches that impress you the most?
You're kind of immune to it now. I mean, you get to know these coaches and you get to know them personally, and you've played against them or you've studied them in the past. I mean, I remember my first game really having a booth. That was in 2016. And I've sat down with Bob Stoops, my first coaches meeting ever, where I was actually in my own booth, and I thought that was super cool. I'm in Bob Stoops' office. This is awesome. I mean, remember that being a big one, but he kind of recruited me a little bit, so it wasn't as eye-opening, but there were a few, that obviously stand out, but kind of back to the South Carolina question. Like, I always had a tremendous amount of respect for that place. I always thought that it was just a cool place because, they were a little bit like Mississippi State in a sense where, man, when you played them, you better pack your freaking lunch pail. Like, it's going to be, we're probably going to win, but I tell you what, we better earn it, and it was going to be hard. And if they get hot, look out. And that's what happened in 10. I mean, they just couldn't miss. Alshon had a ridiculous day. We had a couple of young corners that struggled with his size and his catch making ability. Coach was calling a really nice game, mixing up screens and, Lattimore on like little tiny screens and things like that. Steven Garcia got hot. So it was one of those where we kind of ran into a buzzsaw a little bit. And we hadn't at that point played well. We had lost earlier, or we had won earlier in the year against Arkansas at their place, and we did not play well in that game.
I remember y'all were down.
Yeah,
I remember you led the comeback. Yeah.
We ended up coming back and winning it, but it wasn't pretty. I mean, it was one of those like, man, we got a lot of things to address. So we were kind of playing with fire a little bit at that point of the season. A lot of the young guys, I think, just thought because they put a Bama uniform on, we'd show up and we win. And it wasn't that way. That was a really young team in 2010. Now people will look back at it after the fact and say, well, my goodness, that might have been the most talented team Saban ever had. Sure, but you have 3 freshmen on the offensive line that are starting. Chance Warmack, Anthony Steen, and DJ Fluker. 2 of the 3 end up being top 10 picks, but at that point they were freshmen. Obviously you had a veteran at left tackle, you had a veteran at center, and then the receivers were the same, the running backs were the same, and I was the same, but we had a lot of youth up front, so we had a lot of inconsistencies running the football, and the protection really at that point was not great. We just hadn't really quite figured it out. And then defensively, we were really young at corner. Drake Kirkpatrick and D. Milner ultimately both ended up being first rounders, but they had some inconsistencies. At safety, we were breaking a new guy opposite Mark Barron, had some inconsistency. We just had that team had a remarkable. We all tried really hard. We all studied really hard. We all did everything that we needed to do, that we thought we needed to do to be successful. And we had good leadership. We had strong leaders. Dante Hightower, me, Barron, Julio, a bunch of guys that were very strong leaders, but we just, for whatever reason, when one part of the ball was up, the other part of the ball was down. When the offensive line was running the ball well, we couldn't throw it or we couldn't protect. It was just, we could never quite get on the same page. And if you look at it, we ran into a buzzsaw at South Carolina, and then we lose by 3 points against LSU after they run a 30-yard fake punt and convert on 3rd and 18 with Jarrett Lee. How that's possible, I still don't know. We had no business losing that game, but we somehow found a way to do it. And then against Auburn, against Cam and company, we're up 24-0. We have every possible bounce that goes away from us. And there's no excuses, man. We weren't the best team in the country that year, but we were a lot closer than I think people realized. The one bad outlier being the South Carolina performance where they just had our number that day. So it was a good year, though. I think in the long term, looking back on it, I think it helped coach illustrate like, hey man, you got to have your best stuff every week. It doesn't, and look, if you don't create enough separation between the guys you're playing against, it might come down to a play or two. And if those play or two doesn't go our way, we might lose the game. So I think that experience of 10, where we came up short in 3 different games, led to the successes down the road, and coach being able to point to an actual illustration of what happens when you aren't always on your A game. So it was a disappointing way to finish our college career, but at the same time, proud of how much we grew and how much we improved over the course of a 4-year period.
On that game in Columbia, Barrett Jones, who I worked with on some games, we did a game at Williams-Brice, and every time they played Sandstorm, he would reference the 2010 game. He said, Mike, I still have that in my head during nightmares, because they played it throughout. He said, I couldn't get it out of my head that whole time. By the way, he also says, ask Greg about nearly killing a referee named Eddie.
Yeah.
Is this, we almost have a homicide?
I didn't have anything to do with that. That was Rolando. But yes, and Eddie unfortunately was on the receiving end of some friendly fire. We were in a 2-minute drill it had to have been a Thursday practice. I don't recall if it was in training camp or if it was during the season. I really don't remember. It's one of those where like, I really don't want to remember, but Eddie was a referee for years and years and years. And he had been all the way back. Bear Bryant hired him. He had been, I believe he's still going to practice every day, but he was probably 90 years old at the time, roughly, maybe 85. Let's say 90. It sounds better. And he naturally standing where the referees stand is about 12 yards behind the line of scrimmage to the quarterback's right-hand side. And I get flushed from the pocket one time, and I try to throw it away, and Rolando pushes me. I wear a black jersey in practice as a quarterback, but this was in a time and an era where the black jersey was not really. And we talked earlier in the podcast about black and white area. Like, this was very much a gray area. Like, you wore black, sure, you can't get tackled hard, but you can still get hit. Nowadays, they would, I mean, if you touch the quarterback at a Bama practice, I think they'd lose their mind. But it was a little different era back then. Rolando pushed me after I threw it, and I went backwards. I mean, I'm 225 pounds, 6'2", on Eddie, who's 85 years old, 90 years old, can't weigh more than 125 pounds. And Eddie hits his head on the turf. I'm not kidding, so hard. It was scary for all of us. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop I'm sitting over there like panting, like nervous wreck, like freaking out, thinking like he's dead. I mean, it was horrifying. Needless to say, Coach Saban walked over, and I think Eddie would tell the story best. Said, "Eddie, you okay?" And Eddie's like, "Yeah, I'm okay, Coach." He goes, "All right, perfect. Move the drill down 5 yards. Let's go." So checked on him. Eddie was fine. Good. We're good to go.
That's the only reason I knew I could bring that up, because we know Eddie is still with us.
Yes.
And,
Eddie's perfectly fine. Full recovery. No problems whatsoever. No lingering effects. But yeah, Eddie will tell you that was definitely a moment that he had in his illustrious career refereeing the Alabama practices.
Greg, I want to just sneak a question or two in before we let you go, and you've been gracious with your time here, just kind of covering the gamut. First off, talking about the Alabama dynasty, which we don't know if the final chapter's been written yet, but that being said, no matter what happens, the stretch that Nick put together, and I realize LSU had some blips here and there, and certainly they were the chief rival in the West. But I look at the East and what Kirby is doing at Georgia, and of course we're not going to have divisions much longer anyway. But talking about it, as you can hear, we've got guys cutting the grass outside. Is there any chance we could look at a similar type run with Kirby and Georgia as to what Nick and Bama did? Because in so many ways, it looks like I'm watching, like I just woke up out of a coma from 10 years ago, and I'm seeing the heart of Nick Saban and Alabama doing what they did in the early stages. This is back-to-back titles. Nobody is really threatening them in the East. We talked about Shane Beamer. There's Josh Heupel. There's Tennessee. But, I mean, nobody right now is near Georgia in that division. And for that matter, you could make an argument if they do it again this year, how close are the teams in the West for that matter? So is there a possibility of seeing that kind of run in Athens?
I mean, I think they're well on their way. I mean, and I do think, and I think we're all a little curious too, right? When we move to a 12-team playoff, are you giving the Georgias, the Bamas, the Ohio States, are you giving those teams of the world more opportunities to stub their toe in the regular season, still ultimately getting in the playoff, getting another do-over, if you will, and then finding their footing and basically beating up teams that aren't as talented as they are? Will the 12-team playoff benefit the teams that are more talented? I think it probably will. So I do think it might, even for Georgia in some ways, as we move forward into the 12-team playoff era, will it be more likely that they win more national championships than the 4-team or the 2-team? That's certainly possible. But yeah, I mean, obviously you got to keep it going. And I think doing it over the course of a 15-year period is insane. But it'd be hard to bet against Kirby right now with what they've already done and with the momentum they've already created.
I want to go out on one question that, believe it or not, does not have to do with football. It does have to do with your talk show, which obviously you and Cole do a great job. Yeah, you talk nationally, but your bread and butter is going to be Auburn, Alabama, doing a show in Birmingham. And you've had two stories. I think I came on your show right after the whole thing with Alabama basketball and Brandon Miller. Now you have a story with Alabama baseball where the coach gets fired and there's talk about gambling issues and improprieties. It's just been a strange few months with all of that. But how hard has it been to cover those stories for you, being right there in the home of Crimson Tide?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, as an alumnus, I mean, you always want your university to be portrayed in the most positive light possible, but it's not realistic. And this is certainly not a whataboutism by any stretch of the imagination, but we'll use the Bohannon example, the baseball coach example. I think with the era that we're living in right now, the access to gambling, what is gambling, what is determined gambling, what are, all those aspects of it. I mean, we're already seeing it at Iowa State. We've seen issues, kind of pop up in other places. I think we're just getting started on the gambling path. So this is unfortunately going to become the new normal if we don't get it under control very soon. Gambling is no longer taboo. I mean, I do XFL games and we openly talk about gambling during the broadcast. It doesn't come with the scarlet letter that it once did. So access to gambling and all those other aspects, I think, are something that we're just going to have to cover in our world. I hate it, but I do think that it's kind of par for the course with the direction that we're heading. All that being said, I still believe that was an isolated incident, and based on the information that I have at this point, doesn't necessarily speak to what's going on. I mean, Bama actually, after the fact, beat Vanderbilt 2 out of 3.
Right.
Sure. So, I don't think there was any improprieties as far as the team is concerned. It just sounds like the coach did something that was obviously an immediate fireable offense, and he was let go. But you just don't like seeing these things. Obviously, there's always this question, right? It's what's real, what's perceived, what's PR, what is the court of public opinion? You kind of are what your reputation says you are. And whether fair or unfair, it's just you're going to be associated with things, and it's less than ideal. So I don't mind covering it. Like I talked about with the Brandon Miller situation, like all I've ever wanted for Bama basketball as a Bama basketball fan is to be relevant, to make the tournament every year. If we can make it to the second weekend, great. If we can win a national championship, my goodness, and the stars align, that's phenomenal. But, I'm still a Bama basketball fan. I still root for Nate Oates. I'm still root for the players. What happened last year was really disappointing. I think how it was handled from a PR standpoint was disappointing. But it's, it's an opportunity to learn from the mistakes, and it's obviously another opportunity to reflect on the victim in the case. And, I just want to make sure that they're the focus point, not, what was handled after the fact. I mean, focusing on Jamea Harris is, to me, I think the most important thing. And that was a little bit lost in the way that it was covered by a lot of the people in the media.
No doubt. Greg, we'll have to get you back on. I want to talk about the upcoming season. I want to talk about quarterbacks. I want to talk about the draft, a whole lot of other stuff. As always, you're terrific covering the gamut. Really appreciate your work. Kind of from afar. Hope that we can do something at some point together down the road. And again, keep up the great work both on the radio show and on the analyst side. You've truly emerged as one of the best, and we thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate you guys having me. Thanks again.
You got it. Thank you, Greg. Thanks again to Greg McElroy, who does terrific work on ESPN, as well as the radio show Kublick and McElroy. Is it McElroy and Kublick? I don't know, but they both work really well together. And that's been tried before in other situations and has not worked particularly well, having two in-state rival guys in a state where, obviously it's divided among the two universities' fan bases. That one does work. Like you got two qualified guys that are really it's a good listen. Let's just put it that way. Yeah, those two, when I talked earlier about fairness, those two epitomize fairness. I don't agree with every take Greg McElroy or Cole has. Sure. Like from a football standpoint, but I always know and trust that they're being fair. Yeah. Right. There's nothing that's unfair or cheap shottish or anything. So loads of respect for both those guys, really. No doubt about it. Tell you who else who's fair. Our sponsors, Blue Delta Jeans, BlueDeltaJeans.com for the very best in custom fit jeans. Now they've got belts, they've got hats. Check out the website, BlueDeltaJeans.com. And remember, you don't have to show up to their store. You can go ahead and go online, get yourself fit. And before you know it, at your door is the pair of jeans that you will cherish for a long, long time. Also by Look Cinemas. I went ahead and saw another movie, JC. I saw Foreman. It's back-to-back sports movies. Wow. I saw Air, and then I saw Big George. And I thought Big George was going to be bad, honestly, because the reviews were not great. I thought it was really good. I thought the guy who played him was good. I thought the story was good. I
Never know.
2 thumbs up, man. I'm Siskel and Eberting here with a positive review. If you want to check out Look Cinemas throughout the country, it's just awesome, man. You go in there, it's like a world-class theater, food, drinks, all ready to order. And again, as always, we give a pair away. First one that tweets me at Morgan on Air, just type in movie tickets or any form of that, and I'll make sure to get a pair out to you for the closest Look Cinema. JC, the guest parade will continue next week and beyond. Appreciate the last few and you folks out there with your response. Really appreciate that. Also, check out the website, jcandmorgan.com, as we continue to add to that.
Yeah, I'll say something about the website. It's this battleship is now fully operational.
Yes,
Star Wars.
There we go.
Anyway, but it's it's good. You can look for more content there. Not only our podcast, but some written stuff. I know one day I'm gonna write about the movie Three Amigos because it's near and dear to my heart. And we've talked about all these movies lately, and I keep forgetting to mention it.
Is that a $5 or a dimer for you?
That's a dimer, man.
A dimer.
I sent Mike a text the other day. I was like, shoot me if I do not mention Three Amigos next time we talk about movies.
Well, we need to break down. We need to get back into the triple play of flicks.
Got to break that one down. But Greg was so good and thorough and all that. And certainly, sometimes you just gotta let it ride with the guest.
Yeah.
He was great. So
first time we've had him on. And so sometimes with a new guest, you never know how it's going to go. Although with him, you're pretty confident it's going to be pretty smooth, pretty eloquent. So went a little bit longer than we thought we would, but that's okay. If guest is good, we'll just keep on rolling with it. And we'll keep on rolling with you next week on another installment of JC and Morgan. Thanks to Greg. Thanks to JC. If we had a full-time producer, we would thank him. So someday we'll do that. In the meantime, we just thank ourselves. So long, everybody. See you next time on JC and Morgan.